he said, I'm very respectful of my timing, I'm very respectful about it. Okay, so someone made a mistake, let's forget that conversation.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Did everyone get a sheet in the middle there? Thank you so much for joining us again. Okay, so today I want to look at an example of Rav Moshe Feinstein, another sort of examine a different aspect of methodology of psak, of halachic ruling, halachic decision making. I look at an example of Rav Moshe Feinstein seeing a particular societal need, being sensitive to a particular issue in the community, and using an original interpretation of certain sources, or maybe not the necessarily accepted interpretation, to reach a conclusion that he really felt was necessary based on the surrounding society, the surrounding societal issue. So obviously it's very important for a posek, a halachic decisor, to remain true to the Masorah and true to the development of the sources, but it's also really important as a community leader, a halachic decision maker, who's going to take the responsibility of making decisions for the community, to be someone who's a human being, who's sensitive to the human condition, to human nature, to societal factors. And I think that Moshe Feinstein really was the epitome of that, and we'll see a little bit of an example of that today. So, has anyone ever seen the TV show A Wedding Story on TLC? This channel, TLC, they have a wedding story, a baby story, a dating story, and every episode they feature, a couple or a family, and they tell their story of their wedding, of their engagement, of their date, of their baby, whatever. And one time they featured an Orthodox Jewish couple on this show, and one of the ideas that was focused on in the show was how this Orthodox Jewish couple, they didn't have a double ring ceremony. Just in their ceremony, just the man gave the ring to the woman, and that was it. And the producers of the show, and the way that they featured it on the show, I thought that was so interesting and so fascinating and so odd. And what I want to talk about today is that issue, and why is it that that's what you see when you go to Orthodox Jewish weddings, and why, as opposed to in the surrounding community, in the surrounding culture, that's not usually the norm, and why is that the case, and would it be allowed to have a double ring ceremony, etc. So we're going to focus on that question. We'll look at some background sources on that, and we'll get to Rav Moshe Feinstein's response about it at the end. We're actually going to see two different responses of his today. So a double ring ceremony, just to sort of define terms, is a wedding ceremony during which the groom gives the bride a ring, and also the bride gives the groom a ring. And they each say some sort of declaration, some sort of statement accompanying their giving of the ring. And again, as I'm sure many of us have noticed, this isn't really common practice at Orthodox Jewish weddings, and I want to explore why that is. And this is just sort of as a word of introduction, this is putting aside the issue of men wearing wedding rings, after the wedding, in life. That's a separate issue, a separate discussion. Don't worry, my husband wears a wedding ring. I'm not saying I have any problem with that. But there are some Orthodox men who might not. And that's a separate halachic discussion, which we're not going to talk about today. We're going to talk about just the actual ceremony at the wedding and when the man would get his ring, even if he is going to wear one. So according to halacha, according to Jewish law, the Jewish marriage consists of two stages. So there's the first stage, which is the halachic betrothal, the halachic engagement, which is known in halacha as kiddushin or erusin. And then there's the actual completion of the marriage, where we solidify the couple living together as husband and wife, and that's what we call nisuin, when they start to live together as husband and wife under one roof. And back in the times of the Gemara, nowadays we accomplish these two stages at the same, minutes apart, at the same time. It all happens at the wedding. Back in the times of the Gemara, you could do these two stages up to a year apart, right? The woman could be sort of set aside at Mekudeshet, right, for this man, but they didn't actually start living together as husband and wife for a few months. And she would continue to live in her parents' house until they did the nisuin, right, they started to live together under one roof. So the first Mishnah in Kiddushin, in Masachet Kiddushin, delineates three ways to accomplish the first stage of the marriage process, to accomplish Kiddushin. And one of the ways there, the Mishnah says, "Ha'isha nikneit b'kesef shtar rubia." You can do it with money, with something of monetary value, with a contract, or with them having sexual relations. So we're going to focus on the first one, using something of monetary value, which is common practice, which is what we do. That's what the ring is. The wedding ring is doing the kiddushin with something of monetary value. So in source number 1, you see the Gemara discusses how one would accomplish kiddushin this way. The Mishnah listed different ways to accomplish kiddushin, and the Gemara wants to know, how do you do it? If you're going to do it with money, do you throw the money up in the air? Do you jump around in a circle holding the money? How do you do it? What do you actually do with the money? So if you look at source 1, the Gemara says, Hanu Rabbanan, the rabbis teach, Ketzad b'kesef, how does one do kiddushin with money? So the Gemara then, as opposed to if I asked you, how do you cook chicken, you would probably give me a list of instructions. You wash the chicken, take the skin off, sprinkle the spice, whatever, put it in the oven, cover it, uncover it, cook it on 350. So as opposed to kind of giving instructions, the way that the Gemara answers this question is by giving us a case, and we're supposed to deduce from that case what the proper way to do it is. So that's just an interesting note about how the Gemara is structured. But the Gemara says, Natan la kasef o shaveh kasef. If he gives her a ring or money or something of monetary value, the Amar Lan, he says to her, Hareat mikudeshet li, Hareat mureset li, Hareat li into, you are hereby betrothed to me, or you are hereby betrothed to me in a different language, or you are hereby my wife, Harezu mikudeshet. Then they're considered married. She's considered married to him. So if he gives her the ring and he says the declaration to her, that's good. That's what you're supposed to do. Aval hi shanatzna va'amra hareini mikudeshet lecha. But if she gives him the ring and she says, I am betrothed to you, or hareini mureset lecha, I am betrothed to you, in other words, hareini lecha into, I am your wife, eina mikudeshet, then she's not married. The Gemara says, another case, if she were to give the ring and she were to say the declaration of, I am your wife, and all the more so she says, you are my husband, they would not be considered married. So we deduce from this that what are you supposed to do when you're doing kiddushin with money? He is supposed to give her the ring, and he is supposed to make some sort of accompanying statement, accompanying declaration.
May I just ask, we're still in the kiddushin stage?
Yeah.
Okay.
This is all about the first stage of the marriage process. Okay. So the Gemara brings up a question. What happens, so what would you think about a case of 1-1? Let's say he gives the ring, but she says the accompanying declaration. Would that work?
No.
Why not?
I need both, it seems.
He needs to do both?
Yes.
Okay, what makes you think that?
Just the way the Gemara words it, that, unless it seems that in order to be binding, we need to have both.
Okay.
Because even that if she does it, or, it seems to be.
Okay, yeah.
I think if she accepts it, even if he doesn't say it, then that's binding.
Okay, so that's where we're talking about two different issues here. One issue is, do you need this accompanying declaration at all? Let's say he just gives the ring and doesn't say anything. So that's one question. Do you think that would be okay? And we're going to see a little bit about that in source number 2 in a minute. And Sarah, you're talking about which was the question that I asked. What if let's say you do need declaration, would it be okay for her to say that declaration, and you think no? So
After he does, fine, but my point is he needs to say, it sounds as though he needs to do both.
Okay, so that's also an interesting question, which was going to come up later. If he does everything that he needs to do, does what she does after, does that in some way kind of mess up what he does or not? That we're going to also address that question later on. So these are all very important points to raise in analyzing this Gemara. Yeah.
I think when you make a bracha over an action, and you have an action, and then you eat the tree. So I guess it's a complete action. The giving and the bracha over it.
So the person who's doing the action is supposed to be the one who's sort of saying the accompanying statement, because they kind of go hand in hand. Okay, so what the two of you are saying is what Rav Papa says in the next line of the Gemara seems to be implied by the first case brought, by the first statement in the Gemara. Right, so Rav Papa says, Matzkifla Rav Papa. Rav Papa raises a problem, he raises a contradiction. He says, Tama, Z'natanhu v'amarhu. The reason that and you have to sort of insert the words here that are not explicitly written in the Gemara, the reason that the first case works, where the man did both, is because he did both things. Natanhu v'amarhu. That's why we put a check in that box, because he did both things. Ha, Natanhu v'amrahi. If he gives the ring and she says the accompanying statement, Eina mikudeshet, then it wouldn't work. Rav Papa is implying what we should read. Rav Papa is reading the first case and telling us what it should imply about the third case, right, of 1-1, where he gives the ring and she says the declaration. And Rav Papa says, the first case told us he gives and he says that's why it works, because he did both. And if you have anything less than that, it shouldn't work. But, which is, I think, Sarah, what you were saying, how you were reading it. But the problem is, Rav Papa says that the second case brought in the Braita, the second case brought in the original statement that we read, implies otherwise. Ima Seifa, right? But the later statement says Aval hi shenatzna lo ve'amrahi lo havu kiddushin. When the Gemara said that if she does both, that it's not kiddushin. Tama, the reason for that is the natznahi ve'amrahi, because she did both things. Ha natzanhu ve'amrahi havu kiddushin. That, Rav Papa says, implies that it's only a problem if she does both things. But if she did one thing and he did one thing and he still participated, then it would work. Right, so Rav Papa says that these implications from the statement seem to contradict each other. Right, one of them tells us, no, he has to do both, and anything less than that is no good. And the other one seems to imply, no, it's only a problem if he's not involved at all. But if he's somewhat involved, he gives the ring and she says the statement, then that would work. And that seems contradictory. Is everyone with me so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question remains though, so what's the practical conclusion about this type of case? Can the woman be involved in the Kiddushin process as long as the man is still involved also? And I will point out here that the Gemara doesn't bring up the case of Nat Nahiv Amarhu, right? Her giving the ring and him saying the declaration. It seems that that's sort of more clear that that does not work, but maybe it would work for him to give the ring, but her to say the declaration. And that seems to be the question of that's not clear.
Maybe the fact that there isn't that scenario, it seems that maybe they're just so aligned, the two the statement and the action, that, I don't know, it seems to be like a package.
Yeah, so definitely, and the Gemara actually brings three sort of answers to try to reconcile this contradiction. The first is rejected, and the second one is more along the lines of what you're saying. I didn't quote the first two answers here, I put a ... because the third one is the one that's accepted practically, la halacha. But the second one is more along the lines of what you're saying, that anything less than him doing both is supposed to be read as if it's her doing both, and then it's problematic, right? And because maybe the two actions are really sort of need to go hands in hand. And that it sort of begs the question about like, well, what's the role of this declaration? And that I think is really like the overarching question here. What is the role of this marriage declaration? What are some options? What's the point of it? Why do we have it? Right? It seems like the main part of the Kiddushin, according to what the Mishnah said, that you have to use kesef, and according to what the Torah says, that that a man, ki kach ishisha, a man's taking a woman, and the Mishnah says he's doing that with the kesef. So it seems like the giving of the ring is sort of like the main way of accomplishing the Kiddushin. So what's the role of this marriage declaration that's accompanying it?
Purchase?
Well, that's what the kesef is. So why do you need the statement to come along with it, the accompanying declaration?
Should be in front of witnesses that the statement is said on people, that they can't assume anything other than that it is Kiddushin.
Okay, so maybe the statement is there to sort of like make sure that the intentions are clear. You're not giving her this ring as a birthday gift. You're not giving her this ring as an I love you present. You're giving her this ring because you want to marry her, right? Maybe the statement needs to you have to explicitly state your intentions so that there's no confusion about what's going on here. Another possibility is that it's not about clarity of intentions, but it's really about sort of maybe this is what you were getting at. It's really sort of formalizing this this giving of the ring, to sort of elevate this giving of the ring to the level of accomplishing Kiddushin. You need to have sort of a formal declaration accompanying it, and you sort of need that formality. And even if their intentions would be clear otherwise, you still would need that formality. And maybe that has to do with, maybe that question kind of has to do with whether the woman could do it or not. If it's about clarity of intentions, so then maybe she could clarify the intentions also. If it's about, you sort of need this formalizing of the giving of the ring, so then if that's for the man to do, then maybe the woman has to do that. And then maybe the man has to do the declaration as well. Does that make sense?
I wonder, in terms of other types of law,
Mhm.
to acquire a piece of land,
Right.
do you also need some kind of verbal, or if you just exchanged money and you didn't have any kind of, I don't know how
Right,
that works.
so definitely the Rishonim talk about this, comparing this to other types of transactions. And it seems that you do need some sort of statement, or maybe a contract would also work, but if it's gonna be through money, you would need some sort of accompanying statement, but it wouldn't matter who said it, whether it's the buyer or the seller, as long as somebody is saying something. So it seems to be not exactly the same, which makes us think maybe it's not just for clarity of intentions, maybe it is sort of more for formalizing this process. So the Gemara ends up concluding the last line, Natanhu v'amrahi sveikahi v'chayshinan midarabanan, that we don't know what to do with this. It's not clear to us, and therefore we have to sort of account for both possibilities. If a couple does Kiddushin this way, if the man gives the ring and then the woman says the accompanying declaration, we have to account for the possibility that maybe that did really work, and maybe they are really married, but also the possibility that maybe it didn't work, and maybe they're not really married, and we would make them do it again. But if they didn't want to remain as a married couple, we actually would make them get a divorce, because we don't.
Make them get after this one?
Yeah. If they didn't want to remain as a married couple, if they wanted to remain living as a married couple, they could, but they would have to do the Kiddushin again, because it's kind of like being careful about both possibilities, right? We make them get married again because maybe they're not really married, but we also make them get a divorce because maybe they are. We don't know. Okay, so it seems that, so to conclude from this source, the ideal way of doing it is for the man to give the ring and the man to say the accompanying declaration. Now, we spoke a little bit about what is the role of this declaration, and we are going to shed some light on that from source number 2. Source number 2 talks about, what about a case where a man and woman are sort of having a conversation about getting married, about their wedding, and then he puts a ring out on the table, she takes it, she accepts it. Are they married then? Is that enough? That's what source number 2 talks about. So let's look inside. Source number 2 says, if a man was talking to a woman about the matter of her divorce document or her marriage, to him, right, with that man who's talking, and then he hands her the divorce document or the marriage document, or money, right, the ring. The low period, she doesn't explicitly explain, he doesn't specify what he's doing, what he's giving this for. If it's a divorce document, then it's obvious because it says it in the document, right? But if they were talking about, and marriage document also would be obvious because it says it in the document. But if we're talking about a ring, then he doesn't specify what he's doing. So Rabbi Yossi, in this case, Omer Zayo, Rabbi Yossi says, that's enough. They would be considered married. That's enough for them to be considered married. And Rabbi Yehuda says, Tzarich lefaresh. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Tzarich lefaresh. That he has to specify what he's doing here. Then,
It doesn't say anything about a ring, though.
well, it says v'natan la gita v'kiddusheha. So v'natan la kiddusheha could be any of the forms of kiddushin. Right, anything that could be used for kiddushin. And which I think you would have to assume means a ring, because if it was a shtar, if it was the document, then it would say, then it is mifurash, right? It says it inside the document.
It could be money, because the ring has to be worth a certain
Yeah,
amount
could,
of money.
when I say a ring, I mean
Oh,
any form, anything, a ring is generally what we use as our example of something that's of monetary value, but it could be anything else. It could be a bracelet, it could be a $100 bill, any of these things.
Now, when they throw the get in here,
Yeah, that's good.
that confuses things, right? Because as far as I know, there's no accompanying statement to delivering a get.
Right, so you're right, it's a good question, and
So they're
also the
not
get
comparable.
does seem to itself explain in it what's going on, so why would, like, you don't need it for clarity, which
Yeah.
makes me think maybe it's not really about clarity, maybe it's more about some sort of like formalization of the process. Okay, so Rabbi Yossi says it's enough, Rabbi Yehuda says you need to explain. And then Rabbi Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel, says that for Rabbi Yossi's opinion, when he said that it was enough, that he didn't need to specify further the husband, it's only if they were talking about the matter of the marriage or the matter of the divorce, if that's what their conversation previously was about. They were sitting around, they were at Lazy Bee, they were having a conversation, they were talking about their wedding, they were talking about the hall and the date and who's going to be Messiah Kiddushin, who they're going to invite, etc., who's the caterer is going to be, and then he gave her this ring. But if they were talking about the weather and then he gave her this ring, then that would not be enough, even according to Rabbi Yossi. So it had to be that they were talking about the matter of the wedding. And then the Gemara further clarifies, according to different opinions, what exactly they have to be talking about. We're going to skip that for now. But the question becomes, okay, so in the first Gemara we saw that if the man gives the ring and the woman says the declaration, then we're concerned that maybe that doesn't work, maybe that's not good. But here, if the man gives the ring and doesn't really say anything, they're just having a conversation, then that is okay. So what's sort of going on here? What is it about the woman's declaration in the first case that is problematic? So if we look at source 3, the Tosfot Rid, who is an Italian, one of the Balei HaTosafot, one of the Tosafists, he comments on this Gemara, and he says, and I'll read it in English, if he gave her something, or if the man gave the woman something, and nobody said anything, him or her, then it would be a valid marriage. Because we rule, like Rabbi Yossi's opinion in source number 2, that if they're having a conversation about the wedding and no one says any sort of formal declaration, then that is good enough, that it is a valid marriage. Right? But in the case of saying something, in the case of her saying something, then the marriage is invalidated because it looks like the Kiddushin is being affected by her words, and we require that it be affected by the man's words, right? That if you have a case of they're having a conversation about the wedding, he gives her the ring, and no one says anything else, then that's sufficient. But going back to one of the questions that we raised before about what effect her participation has, even if he already did everything he needs to do, does her participation sort of negate anything or undermine anything? So according to the Tosfot Rid, it seems like it would, right? That we require that the Kiddushin be put into place by his giving and his saying, his declaration, his actions, and if she adds anything, that sort of like makes it look like maybe it's being effectuated by her actions, and that's problematic according to the Tosfot Rid. So he says in a case where nobody said anything and they were just having a conversation, that we're okay with, but why in the Gemara earlier did it say that if she says the declaration that's a problem? It's because that looks like it's her, participation that's effectuating the process, and that apparently is problematic. Okay, so that's the Tosfot Rid's opinion, but in source number 4, we'll see the other side of this coin, the Meiri, who's one of the medieval commentaries from Provence, 13th century, and he says differently. He says, some commentaries say, and we're reading in the English in source 4, some commentaries say that they're not definitively married in a case where she says something, if they weren't having a conversation about it, and she said something specific. But if they were having a conversation about it, then they are definitely married, since that's not worse than having a conversation and nobody specifying anything. So he says, in a case where there was no conversation, there was just a giving of a ring and by him and a giving and a declaration by her, so that's problematic, because the Gemara said we can't be certain about that case. But in a case where they were having a conversation about it, and he gives the ring, which the Gemara says that if just that alone happened, then that would work. Then if she adds on after that, she says some sort of formal declaration, then that's fine, because that's no worse than her saying nothing at all and them just having a conversation and him giving the ring. That's what the Meiri says, right? As opposed to the Tosfot Rid, who said man and woman sitting in lazy bean having conversation, man giving ring, check. If you add to that scenario the woman saying some sort of formal declaration, then that ruins it. The Meiri says, no, that doesn't ruin it. That's no worse than her not saying anything at all, them just sitting in lazy bean having a conversation, and he gives her the ring. If that's okay, then if she adds something, that's also okay. What difference does it make, right?
The ring has already been given, and it's done.
Right, it's already done. Everything that you needed to be there is there. All the requirements are there. So if she adds something that doesn't ruin it, it doesn't undermine it, as opposed to the Tosfot Rid before, who said, no, it does undermine it because it makes it look like it's not happening the way that it's supposed to, and that creates a problem for the Meiri. Once it's done, and you have all the requirements that you need, so we don't care what happens after, right? So far, so good. Everybody with me?
Yeah.
Okay. So the Shulchan Aruch rules, in accordance with the Meiri, that if you do this, we'll read it inside, source number 5, Natanuva Amrahi, if you have a case of him giving the ring and her saying the accompanying declaration, Im haya midaber ima al askei kiddushin, have vadai kiddushin. If that's happening in a scenario where there was also some conversation about their wedding, where the man was participating in this conversation about the wedding, then that would be valid, right? You have the conversation in lazy bean about the wedding, man gives the woman the ring, and then she says some sort of accompanying declaration. That's okay, because he sort of did his part of participating in that conversation, which apparently is sufficient to qualify as his, accompanying declaration of his giving of the ring. And then whatever she adds on after, it's okay, right? The Shulchan Aruch says that counts as kiddushin. The imlav, if not, right? If you don't have that accompanying conversation and you just have him giving the ring and her saying the accompanying declaration with nothing else, then that would be safek kiddushin, right? Then we're not sure if that counts or not, which is what we saw in the Gemara. But another example of how it could work, if he gives the ring and then she says, I am here by your wife, and then he says, yeah, I agree with that, I'm on board. Right? If he says yes, b'sha'a netina, at the time of the giving, have vadai kiddushin. That would also count. Afilu ein asukin bo'to inyan, even if they're not sort of engaged in a conversation about their wedding. If he gives a ring and she says, I'm your wife now, and then he says, yeah, sounds good to me, then that would also work. Okay, so the Shulchan Aruch seems to go on the side, follow the side of the Meiri, that it's not a problem if she adds in a piece, as long as his required pieces are there. If she adds on her piece, that wouldn't be a problem. So tell me what you think about double ring ceremonies, right? A double ring ceremony is not exactly what's described in the Gemara, because in the Gemara we're talking about he is the only one giving a ring, there's only one ring involved, and she's saying an accompanying declaration, and we concluded that that's okay as long as he also says, if he does both things and then she also adds something, that's okay.
It's probably better if he goes first.
Okay. Yeah.
Right? I mean, according to
So,
law.
but with the double ring set, do you think that any of this would change if if he gives a ring and he says his declaration, and then she gives a ring and says her thing? Do you think that would
make no difference.
it should make no difference if what's done, what we need to be there is there, so it should still work even if she sort of adds on her piece, right? Okay.
Well,
So-
what if what if by her giving a ring, it could be interpreted as her reimbursing the cost of his, because we know that he has to give her something of value.
Right, but I'm not sure if we would interpret it that way, because then why wouldn't we just not have any rings? As opposed to like, he gives her one and she gives him one to sort of even it out, we could just not have any.
You can't not have any, you have to have one of the three things.
Right, but then, so you, okay, so, but I'm not sure why we would interpret her giving her ring as,
Somehow invalidating his gift.
I think validating it is, but I don't know if it's like reimbursement, right? I don't know if that takes away from the fact that like he owned his ring when he gave it to her. I think it's still,
Actually, does it matter if she goes first or he
Yeah.
goes first?
maybe, because you
What'd
could,
you say, Sarah?
Maybe it wouldn't even matter. I assume that maybe he would have to go first if he had a double ring ceremony, but maybe if she went first, halachically it's as if nothing happened.
and then when he does his
Mhm.
part, then
Maybe
it
he
counts,
doesn't
right?
know
So maybe
She's just
it
giving
should.
gift, and that's right.
If she were to give back his ring, so then that's an interesting question, whether that would be a problem. I don't think so, because, again, like, once it's done, and then if she wants to, whatever she wants to do with the ring after, she wants to throw it in the garbage, if she wants to give it to somebody else, if she wants to give it back to him, I don't know if that would be a problem, but it's an interesting question. Because the Gemara does talk about other types of methods that could be used for Kiddushin, and doesn't like ones where she has to sort of give it back. So maybe we wouldn't like that. Yeah.
I have a point. Before you were born, there were lots and lots of cases, not lots and lots, but occasionally cases in high schools, Jewish high schools,
Mhm.
the boys would say something to
Yeah.
girls, and then it was a whole tra-la-la. I don't know if this
Still-
happened
it's
in
still
your
good.
class.
Still
So
happens.
what happens then?
So those are very, first of all, whenever I teach this to my students, I always make the point to them how you can't make jokes about this, and this is something serious, and we have to take it seriously, and you really could, like, cause problems. When those cases happen, when,
Do they have to be
when-
witnesses to it?
yeah, so there's a lot of requirements that do have to be met, right? They have to be over certain ages, they have to be able to, like, have knowledge and awareness of what's going on. There do have to be, like, 2 over bar mitzvah male witnesses. The thing that they're using has to be of a certain value, although the value is not very high. Like, what a Kiddushin the value has to be a pruta, that's not a lot of money. There are certain requirements that have to be met, but unfortunately, sometimes you do have these cases in camp or in school where kids are making jokes, and depending on the details of the circumstances, like, sometimes it really does need to be brought to a competent posek to, like, hear all of the details and kind of make sure that you can find a way out of it, and hopefully you do, and you don't require these kids who are making a joke to have a get, because that does really have serious ramifications for the woman. She can't marry a Kohen anymore. So usually, like, they're able to find a way out of it.
Maybe you should advise her to say something and invalidate it.
What?
Tell your girl.
Right, to say,
Anyone
well,
proposes to in camp,
it's only invalidated as a suffix, though, we still do require a get. But I think it is important to, like, teach our students that this is something not to be made a joke out of, it's something that we take very seriously, and that could have serious ramifications. Right, we're very careful about this sort of on both fronts. Like, on the one hand, at a wedding where the couple really does want to get married, they're having a wedding, we go to great lengths to make sure that, like, we're really, following every single chumrah and making sure that we're, all the details, the requirements for witnesses, let's say, or it can't be a relative. But that probably doesn't mean, like, your 15th cousin. Probably your 15th cousin is okay, but still, like, a rabbi who's being Masar Kiddushin probably wouldn't let your 15th cousin, if you knew it was your 15th cousin, be an aide, because we're, like, very, very careful to make sure that this Kiddushin is valid. But on the other hand, when we don't want a Kiddushin to be valid, we also have to be very careful that there's nothing there that might potentially allow it to be valid. So we're sort of, like, very careful on both sides, because these issues of personal status are serious. Like, they have serious ramifications. So I always do try to kind of convey that to my students, that this is not something to be taken lightly. Okay, so the bottom line is, based on the sources that we saw, is that a double ring ceremony, the Kiddushin should still be valid, right? It should still count. The couple still should be considered married if it was done. Nonetheless, we're going to see that Rav Moshe Feinstein does come out very strongly against this as sort of as becoming practice at Orthodox weddings. He's not comfortable with it. So let's look at source number 6. So source number 6 is a tshuva that Rav Moshe Feinstein wrote, a responsa that he wrote from 1969. And he wrote it to Rav Ephraim Greenblatt of Memphis, and he says, we can read it together in English. So he says, is it allowed, this is source number 6, that the kala also give the chatan a ring under the chuppah? So he says, regarding this matter, that after the chatan betroths the kala with a ring, so he is assuming that the case is that the groom is going first. If the groom did the kiddushin with the ring, So regarding this case where the Kala also gives the Chatan a ring and says, I am betrothed to you, or you are betrothed to me, it is certain that as far as the Kiddushin goes, since it was already done according to Halacha, when the Chatan gave the Kala her ring, it is considered a valid Kiddushin and they are married. And that's basically what we saw in the earlier sources, that the Shulchan Aruch follows the opinion of the Meiri, that it's valid, it counts. It's her adding on anything doesn't undermine what already happened, doesn't undo what already happened. And we don't follow the Tosfot Rid, who did have a problem with that. He says the fact that she also gave a ring and said something, what she said is just considered meaningless and silly, right? So he doesn't see, and I think that in our contemporary setting, we might not see it exactly that way, right? We might understand and be able to sympathize with this need of the bride who wants to also participate in the process, and we wouldn't see it necessarily as meaningless and silly. But I think what he means to say is that halachically it's considered meaningless and silly. It doesn't have any halachic significance. And even though the couple and the witnesses, even if the couple and the witnesses knew in advance that the Kala was going to give the Chatan a ring, it doesn't invalidate the marriage by making it that they are saying that they're only considering themselves married based on both his giving and hers. Because what he's saying here is, even if everybody knew in advance that this is the plan, and in their minds they were saying, oh, we're only going to view ourselves as married once both ceremonies are done, Rav Moshe Feinstein says that doesn't mess it up either, even if, right, because they could say that all they want, but that's not the way that the Torah says to do it, so they're saying that doesn't change anything. Right? He says even if they make that condition explicitly, it's a condition that you can't make because it's against the Torah. So even if they say that from now till Mashiach, it doesn't matter that they said that they made that condition. Even if they try to make their marriage conditional on both of them participating in the ceremony, that doesn't accomplish anything because that's not what the Torah says, so their condition doesn't do anything. So he says the marriage is still valid, they're still married according to halacha, they continue to live together as husband and wife, but he says it's prohibited to do this. He's not a fan of this, he doesn't want people to do this at their weddings, right, for the Kala to give the Chatan a ring under the chuppah, because it is not, he says first of all because it's the custom of non-Jews, and this is another topic to explore entirely, but there's a prohibition in the Torah of chukot hagayim, v'chukotayim lo teilechu, that we're not supposed to follow in the ways of non-Jews. So first of all, there's obviously the prohibition of avodah zarah, but this is a separate prohibition of following the ways of non-Jews, following the customs of non-Jews. And how exactly to define that, what that means, is a separate discussion, right? Because obviously, like, non-Jews wear clothes, they breathe, they walk, they talk, they eat. It doesn't mean we're not allowed to do any of those things. So where do you draw the line? And it also doesn't necessarily just mean we can't worship idols or we can't worship their gods, because that's its own separate prohibition. So what does this mean that we're not supposed to follow in the ways of non-Jews? So there's discussion about that, and Rav Moshe Feinstein here is saying that this would fall under that category. Doing an action like this, having a double ring ceremony, would fall under the category of doing something that's because we're doing it because non-Jews do it, and we're sort of getting this practice from non-Jews, and that's a problem. So we're not supposed to do it for that reason. I definitely there's more to discuss about how to define what's considered chukot hagoyim and why this would fit in. I don't want to get into it now for the sake of time, but that's one of his arguments against this, why you shouldn't do it. And he says, even if you don't make this argument, continuing in that third paragraph, in the second line, right, even if you don't say that it's the custom of non-Jews, it still is prohibited to do it under the chuppah, even without her saying anything, since this might lead people to say that a woman can betroth a man, and anything that might lead to this is problematic. It might confuse people, it might cause people to not be clear about what the halacha really does require, and that, he says, is problematic. So he concludes, it seems, in my humble opinion, that this is a very problematic prohibition, because by doing this, we are, the Kala giving the Chatan a ring under the chuppah, we're causing people to forget the real halachot of Kiddushin, and when this becomes common practice, people, right, even if nobody would come to mistakenly think that just her giving is enough, they might start thinking that the halacha actually requires both of them, both the man and the woman, to give a ring. And anything that might lead to people having this mistaken understanding of what halacha requires is prohibited. So here he says, he comes out very strongly against this. You can't have a double ring ceremony. And if you do, the Kiddushin is still valid, but you shouldn't do it. Now, I want to look quickly at another tshuva that he came out with from 1970, so pretty soon after, where he's talking about reform weddings. And here he's actually said something different from what he says in the first tshuva. The first tshuva was asking about an Orthodox wedding. At an Orthodox wedding, can you have a double ring ceremony? And here he's the tshuva, the question is from a little bit of a different perspective, but he seems to take a different stance on this same issue, and I think this is really reflective of his this aspect of his methodology that I wanted to highlight today, of being sensitive to a need in the community, and taking a little bit of an original approach applying, his understanding of the sources one way in one case and another way in a different case to sort of grapple with the issue that he sees in the community, in society. So let's see here what he says about this case. So here, he's asked about kiddushin performed by a Reformed rabbi. Is it valid or not? And he says, you see what I wrote about kiddushin done by Reformed rabbis in a different place, that we should not be choshesh, right? We should not count those weddings, think of them as having any validity for them at all. He is concluding that kiddushin done by a Reformed rabbi is not, we don't have to worry that it's considered a valid Jewish marriage, a valid halachic marriage. And he says not only because there are no kosher witnesses, no kosher edim, but also because he's assuming that anyone at this wedding would be someone who's not observant of Shabbos and wouldn't count as a valid witness. But also because many of them, and perhaps all of them, don't do a ma'aseh kiddushin at all, an act that they don't do any action that would be considered a valid act of kiddushin. That would be along the lines of what the halacha requires as a valid kiddushin. Since, even though the chatan gives the kala the ring, she also gives him a ring. And her giving proves that his giving is simply a present celebrating that they become husband and wife. But there has not been a ma'aseh kiddushin, an act of kiddushin, and specifically because there might not have been, a declaration. Right? So he says here that the fact that she gives the ring does sort of almost undermine and turn his giving of the ring away from being a halachic kiddushin and into something else, right? It shows that they're both kind of just giving each other presents and they don't intend for this to be a halachic marriage. And then he says, and you can't say that with this giving they are mekadshim each other, they're doing kiddushin with each other, and both givings are for the purposes of kiddushin, because that's silliness and they aren't intending to be mekadesh at all, to do kiddushin at all. Rather, the words they utter are only yeses in response to the rabbi's question of, do you take him or her to be your husband or wife? And these are not words of kiddushin, rather just words of wanting to be married. So here, you see that Rav Moshe Feinstein has this motivation that he wants to be able to say that a reformed kiddushin is not a valid kiddushin. And whenever I show this to my students, I'm always kind of trying to get them to see the underlying perspective here, right? When you first read this, it seems kind of jarring and almost offensive, but when you realize what his motivation is, I think you see that he's actually being very lenient here, not very strict, right? Because it's possible that what they're doing here really should count as a valid marriage. So he's kind of going out on a limb to say, no, we don't have to count this. This doesn't count. And why does he say that? Why does he want to say that? Why is it so important to him to say that? What's the sort of like underlying societal need? Right, because if these couples, if their marriages fall apart and they end up getting divorced, chances are they're not going to get divorced halachically. They're not going to have a get. And then the wife is going to go and remarry somebody else, have children. Those children are going to be mamzerim, walking around the Jewish community. They potentially might marry someone from later, and you have all sorts of problems. So he actually is quite motivated to say that these kiddushins should not be recognized as halachically valid because that will save a lot of potential mamzerim. So I think he's actually he's actually going against like the simple understanding of the sugya here, against and which is how he applied it before, right? Before, in the case of the Orthodox wedding, he said it would still be a valid kiddushin because we have to be very extra careful about these types of situations, and the Shulchan Aruch rules that if the woman adds something, that doesn't undermine what the man did. And here, he's actually going on a limb, and I think looking at it more creatively to say, no, we don't have to recognize these kiddushins because what the woman does kind of tells us that what the man did wasn't really intending to be kiddushin in the first place.
So this would fall into the category of having a conversation about marriage.
Right, it seems like it, but it seems like really according to the Gemara, maybe that should count because they're having a conversation about marriage and he's giving a ring, and right, maybe the issue of the witnesses would be an issue here, but I don't know if in every case you could say there's no valid witnesses. Maybe there were some valid witnesses there. You don't. Right?
So you have to have witnesses in the situation
Yeah.
of the conversation.
Yeah.
There are aides in there.
You have to assume so because you need.
I know, I'm
aidim
saying, but it's
for-
an assumption. It's not.
Right, but you need there. You can't have kedusha without aidim. So I think you'd have to say
All
that
right, but it's unusual. It's a little strange that there's no mention of aidim.
in the case of in the Gemara on Daf.
Right. I mean, let's say if someone else
Right.
is just sitting at the next table. Are they really paying attention to your conversation about
Right.
that? I mean. I don't know.
So that's a good question to ask. Also, in terms of the aidim, like, what sort of like how serious are we about the requirements of aidim? Like, do they need to just kind of like see it, but they don't necessarily need to know what's going on, or do they need to be like very clued into the situation, very aware? So it could be like if people just see it, even if they don't necessarily know like all the context, that would be enough. Which maybe is how you could read that Gemara about the conversation, the lazy being conversation. so maybe Rav Moshe Feinstein could reject the Reform Kiddushin through the Eidim, but he says, even if you don't go that route, I'm still going to reject it. And there are a lot of other big poskim, big gedolim, who disagree with him on this. Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg and Rav Schachter from YU, they disagree with him about this. And I think that this is a kind of an example of Rav Moshe Feinstein's methodology of kind of applying his unique understanding of the sources when he sees a particular societal need that he wants to address. So, yeah, go ahead.
What if there were a conservative wedding, and the young man said Harayat Mekudeshet, and then she gives the ring back? That would be fine, because that was done correctly. Where he did the ring and the Kedushin, Harayat
And
Mekudeshet.
she gave,
And then right after he does Harayat Mekudeshet, she returns with I will love you forever and gives him a ring. Would that be,
so,
valid?
I mean, that's what he's addressing in the first tshuva. So, I guess you have to like figure out what he says about conservative. Right here, he's saying about reform, so he's kind of like assuming that they're not really like operating halachically with like halakhic mindset. Maybe conservative would be different, and would fall under the category of
say Harayat Mekudeshet?
it would
Yeah.
fall right.
Say?
I don't know.
I
What
don't
if I
know.
said it in English? That you are
I don't think it's a
sanctified,
statement,
doesn't
I
matter what
think
way.
that the operative thing, which I don't think is valid anymore, because societally, we've changed a lot since the 1970s, he's making the assumption that there's no from male sitting
Right. I
in
think
that
that's
group.
right.
So, or two, no,
Right.
two. Now that things are very different, and in many from families, there are non-observant who still marry a Jew and a Jew. And in addition, there's the Baal Tshuva thing, where, right? So the families are more mixed, and so what I've heard is that if you're in this situation, in order to fulfill the same goal as Rav Moshe said, that try not to help it become a halachic union, because later on that might be problematic, is that your husband should look away.
Interesting.
Your husband shouldn't look at the chuppah.
That's very interesting. Right, because maybe for those post-game who don't want to accept Rav Moshe's invalidating of this kiddushin on the grounds that it's just not valid, and they want to be able to use the witness, the witness issue, so then for those people it might help to kind of like specifically make sure that there's no kosher witnesses. Okay, so we're pretty much out of time, so I just want to wrap up with source number 8. So going through this whole discussion, I'm sure in the back of a lot of our minds is sort of, the perspective toward Jewish marriage and the questions that I think a lot of us have about, what's the woman's role in the marriage process and what's the man's role, and how does that reflect on the relationship in general. And I think this article by Rabbi Dov Linzer sort of gives us a little bit of food for thought about that question. So the consensus among modern Orthodox rabbis today and common practice is that we follow Rav Moshe Feinstein's opinion, and most modern Orthodox rabbis today won't be Messiah Kiddushin at a wedding that's a double ring ceremony. That definitely still is sort of like the common baseline. I don't want anyone to kind of like walk out of source number 8 thinking that source number 8 is that you're going to see it all over the place when you go to weddings. But I think it's still something interesting to look at and to see people sort of thinking about like how can we sort of account for all these halachic issues, but also still try to include, and I think it is important to realize that even in the sort of like the more classic way of, the wedding ceremony, the woman still is a very important partner in the wedding. She needs to be there. She needs to have knowledge and awareness and acceptance and consent, and you can't marry a woman against her will, and that's very much emphasized and highlighted in the Torah and in the Gemara and Kiddushin, that she needs to be a consenting, actively agreeing party. So I think that that's something important to realize, but Rabbi Linzer, I think here, is trying to address the question of how we can give the bride maybe an even more active role. And I think he does it in a very interesting way that actually tries to give her a role in a way that has halachic significance and that's not sort of just an afterthought. So does everyone have time to read it quickly, or do people, if anyone has to go, please feel free to, I won't be offended if you get up, but I think this is worth seeing, so let's just read it quickly. So he says how the bride can give the groom a ring without halachic problems. So Rabbi Dov Linzer is the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, and he wrote this article. This is just an excerpt from the article of his whole perspective on the wedding ceremony in general. So he says, in the traditional wedding ceremony, known as Kiddushin, the groom gives a ring to the bride, who accepts it but does not offer a ring in return. Today, a growing number of couples would like to have an exchange of rings under the chuppah. So he then cites the opposition to this practice, and he quotes Rav Moshe Feinstein, and he explains Rav Moshe Feinstein's opinion and why it would be problematic to have this double ring ceremony, and we'll skip that part since we sort of already went through that, and we'll go to solutions. So he says, I feel free to read the part about the opposition on your own afterwards, and so we'll go to the solutions on the bottom, and he says, I share Rabbi Moshe Feinstein's concerns and insist on similar parameters. However, this continues to marginalize the bride's giving of the ring. One solution is for the bride and groom to exchange rings after the Sheva Brachot and make mutual declarations of love and commitment in addition to the ring that the groom gives the bride in active kiddushin. So
hello, everybody. Mechanacha time. The seniors are in the big Knesset. The sophomores are in the NPR with a pen, please. Make sure to bring a pen with you and head right to the NPR. Freshmen that are in Mrs. Block's group, you're in room 107 today, and freshmen in Mrs. Detail's group, you're in 121 today. Sophomores, NPR with a pen. Seniors, big Knesset. Freshmen that are in Mrs. Block's group to 107, and freshmen in Mrs. Detail's group to 121. Thank you.
Okay, so the more
Chess team, go to the Beit Midrash and bring the chess stuff. Chess team to the Beit Midrash and go get the chess stuff.
Very exciting place here.
Model UN, Model UN. If you're a Model UN, please go to room 127 because we have our meeting now. Model UN, go to room 127 now.
Okay, he says the practice in Sephardic communities and in Yerushalayim is for the groom to assume his ketubah obligations under the chuppah immediately following the kiddushin. So the ketubah is a document that basically lists what the obligations of each side. You know, generally what the husband is obligated to provide for his wife in marriage and should the marriage dissolve, so that's signed at the wedding, and the husband does a kinyan. He does sort of like formalizing that, taking on those obligations with a handkerchief or a pen or something at the wedding. So it's sort of like lifting up that handkerchief or that pen. He's sort of
if anyone wants an iPhone 6 Plus with a black and gray cake.
So Ashkenazic tradition outside of Yerushalayim is generally that this is done at the chassid's fish, but apparently in Yerushalayim and in Sephardic communities he does this under the chuppah. So this obligation is assumed through an act of kinyan, acceptance of ownership or responsibility, classically performed by the groom, taking an object, often a handkerchief or a pen, from the officiating rabbi in the presence of witnesses. However, since the groom is obligating himself to the bride, it is actually more appropriate that the bride and not the rabbi give him the object. This object can be a ring. This is how such a ceremony would look. Immediately after the kiddushin, the witnesses are called, and it is explained that they are to witness the bride giving a ring to the chatan, upon receipt of which the chatan will undertake his ketubah obligations to the bride. The bride then gives a ring to the groom, stating, "Tikabel tabat zu v'titchayiv li b'chol chiyuvei ketubah zo k'dat Moshe Yisrael." Accept this ring and obligate yourself to me with all the obligations of this ketubah, according to the law of Moshe and Israel. The groom accepts the ring, and the witnesses sign the ketubah. So here he's sort of creating another halachic ceremony that's not the kiddushin, but that's also required at the wedding, and he's allowing the woman to take an active part in that and give a ring. So he's sort of creating a scenario where the bride can give the groom a ring that actually has halachic significance that's not the kiddushin. And he says such a ceremony makes it explicit that the bride is not doing an active kiddushin, but rather initiating the groom's acceptance of the ketubah obligations. It allows for the bride's giving of the ring to take place immediately after the kiddushin, to be done with significant ceremony, and to play a central halachic role. And he says the ketubah was originally instituted to make the woman more of an equal in the marriage, to sort of protect her, make sure that her needs were taken care of and that she was protected. So using the ketubah to create a two-ring ceremony is particularly apt and in keeping with the spirit of the halacha. So I think it's a very creative solution to actually make a way to give the woman an opportunity to give a ring that actually has halachic significance, but also respects Rav Moshe Feinstein's concerns about the kiddushin. And again, this is definitely not yet common practice. Maybe it will become one day, maybe not, who knows. So you probably won't see this at very many weddings that you go to, but I still think it's interesting to see his creativity in addressing this issue.
Have other rabbis spoken about this?
I haven't seen this done anywhere or heard anyone else kind of suggest it, but I don't know.
In this scenario, does the groom give her a ring?
Yeah, for the kiddushin. First they do the regular kiddushin where he gives the ring and he says, "Harayam mekudesh b'kavadzu," like is classically done. And then they call up the witnesses and say, "Now we're going to do the ketubah," which is usually done at the chassid's tish, but they would have, it will be signed at the chassid's tish still, but it will be, the kinyan will be done, his taking upon himself the obligations would be done under the chuppah after the kiddushin, and that's where she would give the ring. But kind of tying everything together, hopefully we saw today an example of Moshe Feinstein kind of really addressing a societal need in a creative way, and also other creative ways to address societal needs nowadays, 30 years after Moshe Feinstein is no longer with us. Thank you so much, and I
Thank
see
you.
many of you next week.